Morning, everyone. So, appreciate we're 50 minutes in and got the last slot talking about pensions, which some days, some years, I'd be maybe a bit nervous about that. I think, to be fair, for today, pensions is actually in a more exciting landscape than perhaps it has been in previous months or years, albeit I also appreciate the irony of we were talking about taking it back to basics a minute ago, and now we're about to go back to the pensions landscape, which is far from the simplest to get your head around. So what am I going to be talking about today? So primarily, we'll be talking about the Defined Benefit Funding Code, which is something that anyone that's involved in defined benefit pension schemes has probably been hearing murmurings of or been hearing a lot about it recently, because it's been on the horizon pre-COVID. And we'll talk more about that in a moment. What else am I going to be talking about today? Well, we talked about the budget in terms of non-pensions, but what about pensions? There's a lot in the media right now about what could happen there. There's a very ballpark figure of how much pensions tax sort of costs the government every year. It's a very simplistic figure that I doubt it actually comes to this much if you were to work out all the complications. But there's about £50 billion every year in tax relief that you could, as a very simplistic figure, say, cost the government. When the government's got this black hole, it's no surprise that they're potentially looking at pensions as a way of keeping to their manifesto promises, whilst also being able to recover some of this if they can. Finally, we'll just talk about the current pensions landscape as a whole. Won't be talking about this in great detail, but I think it's definitely worth talking about. There's a lot of discussions that the previous government and the current government's continuing as to where pensions is going. I think there's a lot of acknowledgement that maybe the defined contribution structure isn't going to provide enough retirement provision for a lot of people in the country, and the government's definitely looking at ways to maximise returns under that structure. We've also got, and you mentioned it a moment ago, collective defined contribution schemes. So the first one launched, I think last week or 2 weeks ago, where Royal Mail launched it for 100,000 employees. The idea of a collective defined contribution scheme is essentially, I won't go into it massively today, but it's like a defined contribution scheme, but where you can put everything in one pot, get better returns, and ultimately deliver up to 30%, if not more, than a defined contribution scheme. At the minute, they're very difficult to get in place unless you're a very big employer like Royal Mail, but the government is exploring legislation to allow something like a nest sort of structure where multiple employers, no matter how small, medium or large, could invest into that structure and open it up to everyone. But that's getting ahead of myself. So, Defined Benefit Funding Code. So ultimately, talking about defined benefits first of all, because that still remains at the moment the biggest pension structure in the country, is we've got a new code of practice and it's live now. We've been talking about it for ages, and I'm just going to talk today about where's it actually ended up. It's worth mentioning the funding code first came into discussion about 2019. Around that time, we still had a lot of pension schemes in deficit, and there was definitely a lot of discussion about, particularly as most of these defined benefit schemes are closed now, what's the end goal? Where are we going? Now, to some extent, the funding code, I think it's absolutely necessary. We need a structure to be able to say what is the end game of these pension schemes that are closed and will become more and more mature over time to ensure benefits are secure. On the other hand, perhaps it seems not as important as maybe it once did a few years ago because of everything that's happened in the years between. We've now got greater surplus and defined benefit schemes than ever before. And so to a great extent, if your scheme's already well funded, I think the overall message is the funding code's something that needs to be complied with as part of evaluation every 3 years. But it's not something that necessarily, I think, trustees or companies need to be too worried about as long as you're well funded. But what do we mean by well funded? So, the code focuses around a funding and investment strategy, and that is asking 4 things. That is, what is your long-term objective of the scheme? And it's asking for that to be formally documented. So is the plan that you're going to run the scheme until the last member dies? Or is the plan that you're going to eventually aim to buy it out with an insurer? Now, that doesn't mean that you necessarily, or something in between, like move to a consolidator, if that's an option available to your pension scheme. That's not necessarily the objective that you then need to fund for. So Everybody that's familiar with defined benefit pension schemes will be aware that as part of a triennial valuation process every 3 years, you are essentially making sure that you've got enough money to fund for your liabilities, and the liabilities are known as your technical provisions. What that technical provisions needs to begin to align to is a low dependency funding target, and the idea of a low dependency funding target is once your pension scheme is mature enough, which is a very actuarial term, which I won't go into too much definition as to what I mean by mature enough, but the scheme actuary or genuinely any actuary can tell you about your pension scheme in question. But a low dependency target basically means the scheme can function by itself with a very low probability that the employer is going to be needed in the future to put any money in. That includes expenses, and essentially it's just the idea the pension scheme isn't really relying on the covenant. Not no reliance on the company whatsoever, just a very low probability. And to aid with that, the trustees and company need to agree on a low dependency investment allocation. And that idea is that that investment allocation is resilient to any changes in market conditions. So you'd be well hedged, essentially, which is why I thought I'd amuse myself by putting a photo of the hedge in that photo. And then a funding journey plan. And the idea there is if your scheme isn't quite yet mature enough that the funding code states that you need to be fully funded on this low dependency target straight away, you still need to say, well, okay, I know I'm going to be mature by the code's definition in, say, 5 years' time, at which point, whatever my valuation is after that needs to pretty much be the low dependency target. What is my plan? Because I know I need to be fully funded on low dependency within 5 years. So it's coming up with a plan to phase your current target of technical provisions towards this low dependency target where it could be as low as sort of a discount rate of gilts plus 0.5%. A lot of pension schemes are already adopting this low dependency target. It's been under discussion for so many years that a lot of trustees, if they've been able to, and a lot of companies have been happy to move to it as long as it's reasonable on both company and trustee. But if it hasn't, if you're using a discount rate that's higher than gilts plus 0.5, then there needs to be some discussion between the trustees and company about what is your low dependency target look like and how are we going to get there. So this slide, I'm not going to talk about it in great detail. It's kind of a picture of what we're talking about when we're talking about a journey plan. So the idea is that at the minute, at the end game here, if we say that that's at the point where TPR would say, right, the scheme's mature, it needs to not have much risk in it at this point. That's when you need to have a notional low dependency investment allocation, and your technical provisions basically needs to be a low dependency funding basis. Until then, you need to agree a notional investment allocation that's eventually, gradually going to phase towards this low dependency investment allocation. You'll still have your technical provisions, and you'll have your journey plan to move towards your low dependency. The funding code's been under a lot of consultation for quite a while, so it's getting a lot more airy-fairy in its final form than perhaps it was at the start. And what I mean by that is it does stress, whilst you agree the notional investment allocation, you agree this low dependency investment allocation, and the TPR would generally expect trustees and companies to have their schemes then investing in line with those notional allocations. You can also somewhat do what you want if you think it's in the best interest of members or other reasons. It's also worth mentioning that there's obviously a lot of discussion in the press at the moment about making use of DB surpluses, and this code at the same time is somewhat in direct opposition to that because we are looking at trying to secure benefits on a fairly low return. There's not much in it necessarily for the UK economy in what this code's talking about, albeit ultimately it's trying to find that balance between securing members' benefits and then anything above the low dependency basis on assets can essentially be invested as the trustees and company see fit, whoever's got the balance of powers in that. There's no limitations on any surplus on a low dependency basis, how you use it. That's for the trustee and company to agree, but if you wanted to invest it all in equities, then that's something that TPR wouldn't comment on because ultimately you're funded on low dependency below that. not going to go into this because I think we're already quite a bit into session and it's very actuarial. But essentially, this is just giving an example of a journey plan. So I spoke before about, say your technical provisions at the minute is using gilts plus 3%, because that's what your investment strategy is targeting. And suppose over time, you need to get to gilts plus 0.5%. The code does ultimately suggest you've got many options for this, but one option might be to agree a stepped approach where you're slowly going to de-risk your investment strategy over time. And these might be already discussions you've had with your investment consultant, that you've had with your actuarial advisor, because a lot of the stuff the code's saying was stuff that we as the industry were already mostly doing. It's just now making it more of a fundamental concept. But ultimately, this is talking about if you've got this level of risk here and you need to get down here, the way you do it is up to you. You can gradually, sort of continuously move down your return, or you could agree stepped changes in your investment allocation, perhaps linked to if you get certainly good returns on your assets over time. Then at that point, when you're at a certain funding level, maybe agree to then de-risk your investment strategy slowly. In terms of the journey plan considerations, this is where there's a lot of guidance in the funding code, and it would be next to impossible to talk about all of it within the time I've got today. But the main things it focuses on, a lot of it again isn't different to what you would have heard on a triennial valuation, is a period of covenant reliability, which is looking at essentially how long can you be confident that there's cash flow that the company can pay towards the scheme, and that's sort of a reasonable period for the trustee to have for the length of any journey plan required for contributions to be paid in. There's also the period of covenant longevity, which is what's the longest period of time you can be confident the company's going to be around for. Because no matter what the company is, every company's got a limit as to how long they might be around for. We don't know what's going to happen in 20 years. And I appreciate you could be thinking of the Apples and the Microsofts and say, well, there's lower and lower likelihoods, but nonetheless, nothing is certain. I've put this box called supportable risk in here, which is quite a brief sentence for what's discussed quite a bit in the code. So the code does give reasonable flexibility in terms of if the employer can justify that it's investing within sustainable growth, or it can afford the covenant leakage by paying out to shareholders, and it can justify that while still being able to support the pension scheme, TPR will accept it. Nonetheless, the closer and closer a scheme now gets to being mature enough that it needs to de-risk, the more and more TPR would expect contributions to start flowing more into the pension scheme. There's not a hard and fast rule to say how this is going to work for every single pension scheme. There'll be some pension schemes where this makes perfect sense, and there'll be some pension schemes where maybe the size of the scheme is very small compared to the overall parent, and you could argue maybe the covenant or a parental guarantee could cover it. The code does cover various approaches to this, and it's worth speaking to your advisor about how exactly it affects it. There's no forced requirement to have the contributions in on this low dependency allocation, but there is a stepped process that needs to be discussed, and the pensions regulator will definitely take an interest if it's not following a simplistic approach of being fully funded on a low dependency basis. But they do also accept that there's many different ways of funding a defined benefit pension scheme, and how exactly you go about it is up to the specifics of every company and trustee. Which kind of gets me onto this fast track or bespoke approach, which is essentially a way of the regulator saying, we appreciate the code's quite long. Is there a simple way of satisfying this without sort of us having to spend a lot of time talking to you? And the answer is yes. So the fast track approach essentially sets a margin of which your technical provisions has to be of your low dependency. So say this is an example, I can't remember the exact numbers, but say you're 2 years away from being significantly mature, at which point you'd expect to be fully funded on a low dependency basis. Then the easiest way to satisfy the regulator would be to satisfy its requirement where I think it says something like you need to be 98, 99% funded, or your TPs needs to be 98 to 99% of your low dependency target when you're 2 years away, So the idea is you're gradually phasing in your TPs. You're not using a very not optimistic, but you're not using a discount rate of, say, gilts plus 5%. I don't think I've ever seen anyone use that, but at least not for a while. But a gilts plus 5% discount rate 2 years before you're about to get significantly mature, and then you're suddenly going to turn around to the regulator and go, oops, now there's a huge increase in my liability that I wasn't prepared for. So that's just the regulator's way of saying, as long as you're being sensible about it, we're not going to sort of ask you too many questions. They do have this goal that below dependency discount rate shouldn't be higher than gilts plus 0.5, but this is to stress, this is under a fast track approach. They are happy with a bespoke approach as long as it can be justified. And what they mean by justified is sort of under discussion, but it would just require a few more conversations with the regulator, but they would accept reasonable discussion in that area. Nonetheless, if you do want to have the life of least resistance, they also say that your recovery plan shouldn't be less than 3 years if you're at the point where they'd expect you to be fully funded on low dependency, or less than 6 years if you're not quite at that point of significant maturity. And that's sort of their hard and fast rule. They also do a check on your investment risk just to make sure that it is resilient to changes in market conditions. It's somewhat based on PPF stresses that they already apply. And that's just, again, checking that not only are you well funded, but also the investment strategy is resilient enough that we're not concerned about the pension scheme, even if another incident happened like a couple of years ago in the budget, or 3 years ago. Finally, there's a statement of strategy, and that's a formal document that needs to be completed by the trustee and company as part of every triennial valuation going forward. That essentially sets out everything we've discussed here. So it sets out what is the long-term objective of the scheme. It sets out how are you planning to get to low dependency funding if you're not already there. And it gets also a bit more, qualitative rather than quantitative in terms of it also asks the trustees to comment on how well is the strategy being implemented, and also even asks the trustees to reflect on any lessons learned if they think their previous strategies not worked as well as they would have liked. That's had maybe a bit of pushback in the industry because such a qualitative judgment, also a judgment that's going to be documented, it's arguably open to interpretation and maybe not that comfortable of an area to have to formally document. But nonetheless, the idea is to make sure that there's reflective feedback going on in the process that's happening to ensure that the scheme's as looked after as it can be going forward. That is everything I had to say about the funding code, sort of within the time allowed for. Before I talk about the pensions landscape, I thought I'd break this up a little bit more because I appreciate you've been listening for a while. Is there any questions on the funding code, first of all? Cool. No worries. So, pensions landscape, or as we say, next Wednesday, what might happen on pensions? So, I don't think I've quite seen this much discussion around pensions and budgets for a while. It's been quite a bit to try and work out what exactly might happen, and I've enjoyed reading various articles, including a 24-page document produced by LCP's ex-Pensions Minister Steve Webb. Ultimately, I'd say there's 4 things that have been going around in the press, and that is, first of all, tax relief, which is, at the moment, all contributions that an employee pays in are exempt of tax. Now, there's a discussion around perhaps introducing a flat rate, say about 30%, which therefore would allow the higher earners to be taxed more, bring more money in, but also not penalise the lower earners, and if anything, it might even encourage them. I think this was one of these early budget discussions. I think my general feel for what is in the media today and sort of everyone having thought it through is that it might ultimately be seen as a manifesto break by Labour on not affecting working people taxes if they were to introduce this. So I would say, and I appreciate when Stuart said, do you want to talk about the budget? I was like, can we delay the breakfast seminar by 2 weeks, please? I could have egg on my face massively here, but I think that one is unlikely to happen. The next one that's very much in the media is the tax-free lump sum. So at the minute, everyone can take up to £268,000 maximum tax-free cash at retirement, being allowed to take at most 25% of their pension as tax-free cash, whichever one is the lower. There's a lot of discussion at the moment about reducing that to about £100,000, and I put medium on there for likelihoods. I'm beginning to personally consider it maybe as it's quite likely to happen. And that's for two reasons. One is, ultimately, I think the government will be looking at the pensions tax and the black hole that's in the current finances, and particularly with how much they've also been asked about, are you going to tax companies? And ministers have repeatedly declined to answer. I think it's quite clear that something's happening, and probably in the pension space. Now, maybe it's more for companies, more relevant for the third one, but for the second one, I'd say the tax-free cash does give a lot of relief and does cost the government a lot of money every year. Also, no matter how this money is raised, it's going to be unpopular, but at least under this policy, there's an argument to be said that you're penalising the higher earners, albeit £100,000 is quite, I think a lot of people will be affected if it moves down to £100,000. I think at the moment, current estimates are if you want a moderate income, and I think moderate's being generous, but a moderate income with also sort of a reasonable income overall, sorry, that made no sense, but essentially you want a £400,000 sort of defined contribution pot would give you a moderate income. 25% of that's £100,000. So anyone above what might be seen as moderate is probably going to be affected. Pension, depending on exactly how your defined pension scheme works, if you've got a pension above, I'd say £20,000, there's a high likelihood that if you wanted to take the maximum tax-free cash, this would be affected. At the same time, it is still penalising those people that are overall better off, and it's an option people can take. It's not something people have to take, so I don't think it necessarily breaks a manifesto promise. Would it be hard to phase in? Potentially. It depends how the government do it. It's also quite a difficult one to see if it satisfies all objectives. For example, it just might mean that people take more pension and less cash, which means that in the short term, the government's not seeing a huge influx because that's money that's going to have to be seen over the medium term, and with more pension being taxed over the longer period rather than seeing any immediate cash being taxed, because based on previous behaviour, people generally will just commute less pension rather than take the tax charge. It also depends how the government do it. So this £268,000, it's a short way of saying that the LTA that was abolished 2 years ago now, or a year ago, used to be essentially 25% of the LTA, which is exactly what that number is, which is why it's so specific to the £5. Previously, when the LTA was changed, they would put some form of protection in, and that would make sure that people that were planning for retirement weren't penalised by suddenly the tax charges getting more penal if they were already above a certain level. There's an argument to be made that maybe some sort of protection should be put in place to not penalise people that were already planning for this now, which again would somewhat circumvent the savings the government's after. Nonetheless, I think it's probably one that's going to happen. I just think it's one that's not going to give them immediate gains, and it'll be interesting to see how it changes behaviour in the long term. The third one is probably then perhaps the one that's the most interesting on a company level, although the second one's probably interesting to us all on an individual level, if we're lucky enough to be able to get that tax-free cash. So at the minute, all employer contributions are not subject to national insurance contributions, and there's certainly some discussion at the minute that a way of getting over the manifesto promise by Labour is by focusing on companies, appreciating that ultimately whatever you do to companies can end up impacting employees anyway, but it doesn't break any pledges. I think. I'm not a legal advisor, I should mention that. Now, there's a discussion then about will they at least introduce some sort of levy. I think at the minute, not having any NI on employer contributions costs about 30 billion. In a very simplistic calculation, all of these numbers would be much lower if you spent days and months calculating the true impact. I think it's very likely something's going to happen in this area. I have seen some discussion around salary sacrifice in particular, because salary sacrifice schemes are perhaps ones that maybe those in this room understand it more than the general public would, but they're ones that perhaps would be easier to start putting tax on and sort of trying to abolish more than employer pension contributions as a whole, because the general public understanding of them isn't as high. It's something that can earn back a reasonable amount of money by removing salary sacrifice arrangements at not much cost. So there is some discussion about maybe the government will bulk a bit at putting anything on the employer pension contributions, and they might focus significantly on salary sacrifice. But I also wouldn't be surprised if they just introduce a small levy, say, at this point. I think we know how it goes with government these days. Introduce something small, and over time, suddenly it gets bigger and bigger. I wouldn't be necessarily surprised if they put in a small levy like 2% instead. I highly doubt they'll go to the full 13%, but I think a levy on pension contributions, either in the form of salary sacrifice or otherwise, is looking likely. But it is one that I think they're going to have to be very careful on, because ultimately, unlike other taxes, say on alcohol or cigarettes, this is something you don't want to disincentivise. Ultimately, we've got this big retirement black hole coming up in the UK. Perhaps less so with the defined benefit era, but with the defined contribution era, it's definitely recognised that more is needed for retirement savers. And the last thing you need is to disincentivise it by introducing measures. So I think it's going to happen, but I think it's going to be very slow and careful. Famous last words. The last one is death benefits. So this is essentially that death before 75 has minimal tax on any DC pot. So if you were to die before 75 and you've got a DC pot, you don't get tax on it. I think a lot of people look at this rule these days and go, 75 first of all feels a bit artificial. It was pretty much introduced at 75 because a lot of other pensions, particularly in the defined benefit landscape, have the age 75, such as the latest age you can retire. And essentially, I think just that legislation carried through. If before 75 it was tax-free. At the same time, how many people die before 75 and how big is their DC pot right now if they do die before 75? Is this really going to get a great value on the government? I think the numbers are very low on this one. Nonetheless, I think they might introduce it anyway, just because it's one that could be seen as not much resistance, at least if you remove the death before 75 tax. There is also a question about pension benefits inheritance. So at the minute, it doesn't count as part of inheritance tax limits, a DC pot or DB pension. I think this one's quite hard to introduce because although you could introduce it on DC pots, what do you do about DB dependents, for example? Those aren't counting towards inheritance tax, so you're going to have to introduce rules for all the different pension systems. Nonetheless, I think that one's quite likely, but really the big savers that the government's probably talking about on the budget are the tax-free cash lump sum and the national insurance on the employer contributions. The other one that is, I should have mentioned on the employer contributions, is it's also not quite yet clear if they do introduce this NI, do deficit contributions or contributions into defined benefit schemes to help towards buyout or low dependency, are those going to come into play as well? I think the current thinking is they can't be separated from the discussion. It'd have to be an all for one. So that's something else to just keep in mind, is that at the moment there might be a consideration as to how does that affect funding if you're not fully funded on where you want to be on your pension scheme, if tax is about to be introduced and make it slightly more costly. Okay, and last but not least, because apparently I love to talk, I'll be very quick. So this is just trying to talk about, the government's got various consultations right now, and I'm sure we'll talk about these at a future breakfast seminar. But it's to stress that It is noted that the pension space isn't perhaps as efficient as it could be, or not delivering for members as well as it could be. It's maybe gone too far the other way, some would argue. Defined benefit was probably too much risk and too much cost for an employer. Defined contribution is probably not enough financial literacy. There's probably just generally the system itself just doesn't deliver enough even when there is enough financial literacy, particularly for those smaller pension schemes that perhaps can't invest in assets that produce as much as maybe the bigger pension schemes can. So there is a review about that. There is also discussion about the surplus and DB pension schemes and where that's going to be used, and we'll confirm on that down the line. Appreciate you've been listening for a lot. So rather than talk about each of these, I've already spoken about CDC a bit at the start. I think all of this is to say there's a lot coming up on the horizon, and we'll talk about it in more detail, maybe at a future seminar when hopefully we know more about it. But I'm quite excited to see where it goes, which my girlfriend judges me for quite a lot. But never mind. Thank you very much for listening, and any questions?